My mother chuckled on the phone from her resort in Cabo. "Your grandfather's just old, Lacey. Old people get sick." In the background, I heard my sister yell, "Tell her to send more money, my card just got declined." I stood frozen in front of the ICU, the phone feeling like a block of ice in my hand. But they didn't know. A soldier's loyalty isn't defined by blood. My name is Lacey Murray. The San Diego Marine layer was a familiar enemy, a damp chill that sinks right into your bones, and it was winning the battle this morning. I stood before my grandfather's house, a classic 1920s craftsman in the heart of North Park, and the silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home. It was a dead, hollow emptiness that felt wrong. My duffel bag, still smelling faintly of jet fuel from the flight home, felt impossibly heavy on my shoulder. I let it drop to the porch with a soft thud. I had been dreaming of this moment for 6 months, picturing my return. I'd pictured the ghost of my grandfather's laughter echoing from the living room, the rich, warm scent of the peanut butter cookies he'd bake for my homecoming, the low hum of the History Channel he always had on. That was the welcome I knew, but there was no smell of cookies, no sound from the TV. I reached out and touched the front door. The brass doorknob was cold, almost slick under my palm. I pressed the doorbell. The first press was hopeful, a bright chime cutting through the gray morning. I waited. Nothing. The second press was impatient, my thumb holding it down a fraction longer. Still nothing. The third was a hollow thud against the silence, a final admission that no one was coming. My eyes scanned the porch, my training kicking in. A crooked welcome mat, a stack of glossy, rain-dampened flyers for a local pizza place stuffed in the mail slot, a single muddy footprint near the door that wasn't mine. These were the details of a house left untended, of a routine broken. In the Navy, they train you to recognize a threat before it announces itself. My internal threat assessment, the one honed in sterile intelligence rooms and on the decks of rolling ships, was screaming at me now from the front porch of the safest place I'd ever known. "Lacey, is that you, dear?" The voice pulled me from my thoughts. Mrs. Gable, my grandfather's neighbor for 40 years, stood at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, rose shears in her gloved hand. Her hair was a neat helmet of silver, her eyes sharp with concern. I forced the smile we're taught to wear, the one that says everything is under control. "Mrs. Gable, it's good to see you. I was just trying to surprise Grandpa." Her own smile wavered. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Oh, honey, he's not here. Didn't they tell you? Your mother, Callie. They all went to Cabo a few weeks ago." Cabo. The word hung in the damp air. A vacation. While I was counting down the days on deployment, they were on a vacation. The mask on my face began to crack. "And Grandpa Silas?" I asked, my voice tighter than I wanted. This was when her expression shifted from concern to pity, a look I despised. "Lacey, your grandfather is in the hospital. Scripps Mercy. It was 2 weeks ago. An ambulance came for him." The world tilted. Scripps Mercy. 2 weeks. Did you see what happened?" Mrs. Gable wrung her hands, the shears making a soft metallic sound. "I didn't see him, but I saw your brother, Kalen. The ambulance was right here, its lights flashing. I asked him if everything was all right." She paused, looking down at her roses, as if she was ashamed of the words she was about to repeat. He just looked out the window, shrugged his shoulders, and said to me, probably just the old man's usual drama, looking for attention. Then he got in his car and drove away. The blood in my veins turned to slush. Usual drama. looking for attention. The words weren't just dismissive, they were a verdict, a judgment passed on a man who had given them everything. This wasn't forgetfulness, this was malice. This was cruelty, served cold and casual on a Tuesday morning. I thanked Mrs. Gable, my voice a stranger's in my own ears, and pulled out my phone. The signal was weak, one bar flickering, a classic San Diego Canyon problem. My call to my mother, Serafina, went straight to a cheerful, pre-recorded voicemail message about being out of the country. My call to my sister, Callie, rang twice, and then clicked off. Nothing. And then, as if delivered by some dark and twisted fate, a notification lit up my screen. Instagram. It wasn't a photo, it was a video, bright and saturated with resort-filtered sunlight. It showed my sister, Callie, her face a mask of bliss, her eyes closed as she let out a delighted giggle while some uniformed resort employee massaged her feet. She was lounging by an infinity pool, a half-empty margarita glass sweating beside her. I could hear my mother's laughter in the background. And then there was the final brutal punctuation, the caption typed out below the sickeningly cheerful scene. Self-Care Sunday deserved it. A switch flipped inside me, not to a scream, not to tears, but to a dead, cold silence. The kind of silence that precedes a storm. All the pain, the shock, the worry, it all coalesced into a single hard point of rage in my chest. I looked up at the Uber driver who had just pulled to the curb, his window rolling down. My voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, a command. It was the voice of Petty Officer Murray, not a granddaughter. Scripps Mercy Hospital, now. The sterile, climate-controlled air of Scripps Mercy was a world away from the damp chill outside. It smelled of antiseptic and something vaguely like floor wax, a scent that immediately puts a knot in your stomach and signals that you've crossed a threshold into a place of quiet crisis. I stood at the main reception desk, the impersonal hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my uniform feeling like stiff, useless armor for a battle I hadn't been prepared for. A nurse with warm, kind eyes and a name tag that read Maria looked up from her computer. "Can I help you, Petty Officer?" she asked, her gaze respectful on my uniform. "I'm here to see Silas Vance," I said, my voice steady. It was the only part of me that was. Maria's fingers tapped on the keyboard, the soft clicks echoing in the quiet lobby. A small frown line appeared between her eyebrows. She looked back at me, her expression softening with something that looked like professional pity, a look I was already beginning to hate. "Of course, he's in the ICU, 3rd floor. But, Miss Murray," she began, her voice dropping, "you're the first visitor he's had. He was admitted 2 weeks ago." The words were spoken quietly, but they landed like a physical blow. First visitor, 2 weeks. The cold rage from the car ride morphed into a hot, burning shame that crept up my neck. The shame wasn't for me. It was for the name my mother and sister carried. A name they were currently dragging through the mud in some luxury resort in Mexico. I could only manage a tight single nod. My throat was too thick with unsaid things. Maria seemed to understand. She slid a visitor's pass across the counter. "My own boy is a Marine," she said softly. "He's stationed down at Camp Pendleton. He's on deployment now." Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, a bond was formed through an unspoken understanding between two women who knew the cost of service. A stranger had shown me more warmth than my own family. "I get it," she finished. The walk to the ICU was the longest of my life. Each squeak of my boots on the polished linoleum floor seemed to count down to a verdict I was terrified to see. When I pushed open the door to his room, the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound. The room was dim, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. And there, in the center of it all, was my grandfather. He looked so small in the hospital bed, swallowed by white sheets and tangled in a web of tubes and wires. His skin had a pale, waxy sheen, a lifetime of sun and sea air seemingly bleached away by the harsh hospital lights. This wasn't the man who had taught me how to tie a bowline knot, whose hands were always steady and strong. This was a fragile echo of him. My analyst brain took over, cataloging the evidence of neglect with a brutal efficiency. His hair, usually so neatly combed, was matted against the pillow, and his fingernails, they were long with dark crescents of dirt underneath. It was a profound insult, a desecration. For a career Navy man who starched his own collars and believed that order was a moral imperative, this was the ultimate sign of abandonment. My grandfather had a saying he'd drilled into me. Loyalty isn't a word, Lacey. It's what you do when no one is watching. They hadn't been watching. They had been sunbathing. I moved to the small nightstand beside his bed. I opened the single drawer. Inside was his old, cracked leather wallet. I picked it up. It felt light, unnaturally so. I opened it. Empty. The slots for cash were vacant. The credit card pockets were bare. They had picked it clean. All that remained was his expired driver's license, and tucked behind the plastic window, a single faded photograph. It was me, age 5, dressed in a tiny sailor suit he had sewn for me for Halloween. The photo was worn at the edges, creased from years of being carried, my grin wide and missing a front tooth, a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. They had taken his money, his means, his independence, but they had left behind the memory. The cruelty of that choice, to leave the one thing that would wound him the most, was breathtaking. This wasn't just abandonment, it was a plundering. Just then, Maria slipped back into the room. His primary contact is listed as Serafina Murray, she said, her voice a low murmur. We've called multiple times. We only ever get the voicemail saying she's on vacation. The last flicker of doubt died. This was a calculated desertion. Change it, I said, my voice hard as stone. Effective immediately, the primary contact and the emergency medical proxy is me, Petty Officer Lacey Murray. I spelled out my name and gave her my satellite phone number. It was the first move in a war I hadn't known I was fighting. The first tile I laid on a new path. I wonder, have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you knew, with absolute certainty, that if you didn't step up, no one else would. After she left, the rage had cooled, forged into something harder, something useful. Resolve. I pulled a chair to his bedside. I reached out and took his hand. It was frail, the skin as thin as paper, but there was a faint warmth to it. I leaned in close, my lips near his ear, my voice no longer the analyst's, no longer the shamed granddaughter's, but the voice of a soldier promising her commander reinforcement. I'm here, Grandpa, I whispered, my promise a vow in the quiet, beeping room. This battle, I'll fight it for you, I promise. I made the call from the hospital's healing garden. The irony was thick enough to choke on. It was a small, quiet space with a burbling fountain and carefully tended lavender bushes, a place designed to soothe frayed nerves and offer a moment of respite. But as I held the phone to my ear, my heart pounding a steady, hard rhythm against my ribs, I wasn't seeking peace. I was declaring war. During my intel training, one of my instructors, a grizzled Master Chief, had said something that always stuck with me. In a psychological confrontation, Don't attack their emotions. They're too well defended with denial and excuses. You attack their supply lines, you cut off their resources. That's how you force them to the table. Right now, their supply line was a joint bank account funded by my deployment pay, and I was about to sever it with surgical precision. The video call connected. My mother's face filled the screen, artificially smooth and radiant from a beauty filter that erased all her worry lines and apparently her conscience. She wore oversized designer sunglasses perched on her head, and behind her, the brilliant blue of an infinity pool melted into the deeper blue of the Pacific Ocean. She was holding a cocktail with a bright pink umbrella in it, a perfect caricature of blissful ignorance. "Lacey, darling," she trilled, her voice a syrupy confection of false delight. "You're back. My goodness, what a surprise. Why didn't you tell me? I would have met you at the airport. You know I would have." The accusation was immediate, positioning me as the one at fault for spoiling her perfect, sun-drenched narrative. I looked at her, at the curated image of carefree luxury, and I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, letting it become a heavy, accusatory presence, traveling over miles of fiber optic cable, from a sterile garden in San Diego to a lavish resort in Cabo. I could see her reflection in my phone's screen, my own face pale and grim. The contrast was startling. Her smile faltered for a microsecond. The mask slipped. "Well, aren't you going to say something? You look so serious." I kept my voice flat, devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. "Grandpa is in the ICU, Scripps Mercy Hospital." The filtered perfection on the screen dissolved. The smile vanished completely. What are you talking about? I thought he just had a little cold?" The excuses started tumbling out, a well-rehearsed cascade of deflections. His doctor said it was nothing to worry about. He was the one who insisted we go on this trip. You know how stubborn he is. He didn't want us to cancel. Then a second face pushed into the frame. My sister, Callie, looking tanned and annoyed, her wet hair slicked back. "Lacey, oh my God, don't ruin the vibe," she whined, taking a sip from her own drink. "We're trying to de-stress here. I seriously need to recharge my positive energy. After such a volatile year, you have no idea what we've been through." Recharge her positive energy. The phrase, cloaked in the popular language of wellness and self-care, was so profoundly selfish it made my stomach turn. They weren't just neglecting him, they were framing their neglect as a form of therapy for themselves. They had granted themselves absolution for their cruelty before the crime had even been fully committed. That was the moment of absolute clarity. The part of me that still held out a microscopic sliver of hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding simply evaporated. My voice, when I spoke, was as cold and sharp as chipped ice. "Enjoy it," I said. "It's the last trip you'll ever take on my dime." Serafina let out a short, sharp laugh, a scoff. "What are you talking about? Don't be so dramatic, Lacey. This is your grandfather's money, and he wanted us to have it." I let her hang on that assumption for a beat. Then I delivered the payload. My tone shifted to the one I used for battlefield intelligence reports. Precise, factual, and utterly devoid of sentiment. "The joint account at Navy Federal Credit Union," I began, each word a carefully placed, explosive charge. "The one you've been draining for the last 2 weeks. I transferred my entire deployment savings, every last cent, into that account 6 months ago to make sure Grandpa was taken care of while I was gone. I have a clear transaction record. I see the charges from the Las Ventanas resort. I see the bill from the high-end jewelry boutique in downtown Cabo San Lucas from 3 days ago. I see the multiple cash withdrawals from resort ATMs, totaling over $5,000. I paused, letting the detailed, undeniable facts sink in. Did you really think an intelligence analyst wouldn't track her own money? The color drained from their filtered faces. For the first time, I saw genuine shock, not remorse, not concern for my grandfather, just the raw, ugly panic of two people who had just been caught. Serafina's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I didn't wait for a reply. I pressed the red icon on the screen, ending the call. The silence of the garden rushed back in, but this time it was my silence, my victory. My phone immediately began to buzz, a frantic, vibrating tremor in my hand. A call from Mom. I declined it. A string of rapid-fire texts from Kali, a torrent of digital fury and disbelief. How could you? That's our money. You are a horrible person. I ignored it. My thumb was already moving with practiced speed. I opened my mobile banking app. The familiar logo of Navy Federal Credit Union appeared. I logged in. I found the joint account. Freeze all cards. A prompt appeared. Are you sure? Yes. Confirm. Change online banking password. Confirm. Transfer remaining funds to a new individual account. Confirm. The whole operation took less than 30 seconds. The buzzing in my hand stopped as they likely realized their access was gone. Then it started again, even more furiously. I silenced my phone, the screen going dark. The battle had just begun. But the first shot and the first victory was mine. One of my instructors at Intel School, a grizzled Master Chief with eyes that had seen too much, used to say, in an information war, the winner isn't the one with the most data, but the one with the best organized data. Never walk into a confrontation without your dossier in order. That night, after leaving the hospital, after the sterile quiet and the rhythmic beeping of the machines, I put his words into practice. I returned to my grandfather's house, but I didn't see it as a home anymore. It was a forward operating base. I went straight to his dusty office, a small room crammed with books on naval history and model ships in glass cases, a place that once smelled of old paper and his pipe tobacco now just smelled like neglect. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I channeled all the grief and fury into a cold, methodical purpose. I turned the office into my war room. With the precision of an analyst preparing a brief, I began to gather intelligence. I started with the stacks of mail on the desk, the shoeboxes full of receipts, the file cabinets he kept meticulously organized with his military discipline. Utility bills, bank statements, medical records, letters. Everything was a potential piece of evidence, a single thread in a much larger, uglier tapestry. I set up my ruggedized military-issue laptop on his old oak desk and began the painstaking process of scanning and digitizing every single document. Hours bled into one another. The only sounds were the soft hum of the scanner, the quiet click of my keyboard, and the distant wail of a siren in the San Diego night. I created a new, encrypted folder on my hard drive, protected by a password 24 characters long. Inside, I built a file system, color-coded for clarity and immediate threat assessment. Green was for Grandpa's legitimate income, his Navy pension, his Social Security benefits, the small dividends from stocks he'd bought in the 70s. Yellow was for financial requests from the family, cloying emails from Callie asking for help with her rent, texts from my mother about a car repair that always seemed to cost more than quoted. And red, a folder that grew alarmingly fast, was for suspicious expenditures, the ones that had no corresponding request, the ones that felt like theft. The house was no longer a place of sad memories. It had become an arsenal of information, and I was its commander. Deep into the night, fueled by black coffee and a burning sense of purpose, I dove into the bank statements. That's when I uncovered the pattern. It was a sickeningly clever system of fraud they must have thought was untraceable, a family conspiracy of greed. I later learned the term for it is double dipping. I found a receipt, a flimsy piece of carbon paper from a local marina. It was for a $2,000 cash payment for Kaylin's boat slip fee paid by my grandfather. I recognized his neat, block letter signature at the bottom. Then, just 1 week later, on the bank statement, I found a corresponding transfer from the joint account, the one funded by my money, to my mother, Serafina. The memo line contained 2 words, Kaylin's boat. They had gotten him to pay in cash, then charged the same expense to my account, pocketing the difference. It was brazen. It was a coordinated attack on a trusting old man. I opened a new Excel spreadsheet. I named the file fraudserafinaMurray.xlsx. With cold detachment, I created columns, date, amount, description, evidence link. I entered the first line item for the boat slip fee. The spreadsheet was impersonal, logical, just cells and numbers, but each row I added felt like hammering another nail into the coffin of their lies. The final phase of my intelligence gathering came from the old landline phone on his desk, the one with the built-in answering machine. I pressed the play button. The machine whirred, and then my sister's voice, sweet as honeyed poison, filled the silent room. "Hi, Grandpa, it's me. I found this life-changing meditation retreat in Ojai. It's only $1,500, and it's really an investment in my long-term peace of mind. I know you'd want that for me." Click. The next message was from my brother, Kaylin. His voice was clipped, annoyed. "Look, I told you, I don't have time to drive you to the VA hospital for your appointment. It's on the other side of town. Just get an Uber." Click. The well of evidence was deep. I logged into my grandfather's email account, the password a simple one I'd set for him years ago. I searched for Cabo. An email from my mother to a travel agency popped up, dated 2 months prior. The final line chilled me to the bone. "Just charge the full amount to the card on file. My father just got his veteran's pension payment. He won't even notice it's gone." Have you ever stumbled upon something like that? A piece of undeniable proof that turns a suspicion into a horrifying certainty? That's the moment the ground falls out from under you. I saved everything. I downloaded the audio files of the voicemails. I took screenshots of the emails and text messages. My training in data security was second nature. I created 3 separate backups of the entire dossier, one on a portable hard drive, a second on an encrypted cloud service, and the third on a small discrete USB drive that I threaded onto the same chain as my dog tags, to be worn around my neck. It rested against my skin, a cold, hard piece of metal, a constant reminder of the fight to come. I was ready. In the Navy, there's a fundamental rule. When facing a situation beyond your expertise, you find the right specialist. You don't try to captain a ship you don't know how to navigate. My dossier of evidence was a powerful weapon, but I was an analyst, not a lawyer. I knew how to gather intelligence, but I didn't know how to deploy it in a courtroom. I needed an expert. I didn't waste time scrolling through online ads for slick, expensive law firms. My first and only stop was a place I knew would understand the core of the issue: the Legal Aid Society for Veterans, located in a modest building downtown. I walked in, my dossier-laden laptop feeling heavy in my bag, and sat down with a volunteer, an older gentleman with a kind face, and a Marine Corps pin on his lapel. I didn't give him the emotional story. I gave him the facts: a decorated Navy veteran, financial exploitation by family, and neglect resulting in hospitalization. I laid it out like a mission brief. He listened patiently, his expression growing more somber with each detail. When I finished, he didn't offer platitudes. He slid a business card across the table. "There's a lawyer," he said, his voice low and serious. "His name is Elias Croft. He's young, but he's a bulldog when it comes to elder abuse cases, especially with veterans." He tapped the card. "He doesn't fight for the money, petty officer. He fights because it's the right thing to do." Hope. It was a foreign feeling after the last few days, but a flicker of it ignited in my chest. I didn't need a hired gun. I needed a warrior. Elias Croft's office wasn't in a gleaming high-rise. It was on the second floor of an old brick building in Little Italy, above a bustling deli that sent the smell of garlic and oregano wafting up the stairwell. The office itself was functional, cluttered with law books and file boxes. No fancy art, no panoramic city views. This was a place of work, not prestige. Elias Croft himself matched his surroundings. He was a man in his early 40s, with a sharp, intelligent gaze that seemed to miss nothing, and a firm, no-nonsense handshake. He wore a crisp shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, ready for a fight. He listened to my initial summary with a professional, skeptical patience. I could see him assessing me, trying to separate fact from emotional hyperbole. But when I placed my laptop on his desk, turned it to face him, and opened the color-coded, meticulously organized file system, his entire demeanor changed. He leaned forward, his focus narrowing. I watched as he clicked through the folders, his eyes scanning the digitized bank statements, the screenshots of emails, the transcribed voicemails. His expression grew more and more serious with each piece of evidence. He finally landed on the Excel file, Fraud Serafina, Murray.lsx. He scrolled through the line items, the double-dipped boat fee, the meditation retreat, the phantom car repairs. He stopped, leaned back, and let out a slow, heavy breath. He shook his head, not in disbelief, but in weary recognition. "My God," he said, his voice a low rumble of controlled anger. "She didn't even try to hide it." In that moment, I knew I had found the right man. I had found my ally. Elias leaned back in his worn leather chair, lacing his fingers behind his head. He looked at me, and for the first time, the professional skepticism in his eyes was replaced by genuine respect. "Petty Officer Murray," he said, "you've already done 90% of my job for me. This is one of the most well-documented cases of financial elder abuse I've ever seen." He paused, his gaze drifting to a framed photo on his desk. It was of an older man in a Marine Corps dress uniform. "My grandfather was a Marine," he said, his voice softening, becoming personal. "He served in 2 wars. He lost his entire life savings to a relative who saw him as a walking ATM. I was just a kid, in law school. I couldn't do anything to help him then." He looked back at me, and the fire was back in his eyes. "Things are different now." He turned back to his computer, his focus absolute. He began to map out the strategy, speaking in clear, decisive terms. "First, we file for an emergency asset freeze and a temporary restraining order. That will stop the bleeding immediately. Concurrently, we file a petition for a full conservatorship of the estate and of the person. We'll use your dossier to prove he is unable to manage his own affairs and is susceptible to undue influence." He wasn't making false promises of an easy victory. He laid out the potential challenges, the fight my family would likely put up. But then he looked at me, a warrior recognizing another. "I can't promise you this will be fast or painless," he said, "but I can promise you I will fight this to the very end." For the first time since my boots hit the ground in San Diego, a massive weight I didn't even realize I was carrying began to lift from my shoulders. I was no longer a lone soldier on a forgotten battlefield. I had found an ally. The war was far from over, but now I had an army. The day of the hearing at the San Diego Superior Court, I chose my weapon carefully. It wasn't a document or a piece of evidence, it was my uniform. My Navy service dress blues, perfectly pressed, the ribbons and medals aligned with geometric precision. It was a statement of principle before I'd even said a word. When I enlisted, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I never imagined that sometimes the enemy looks just like your own family. They were waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom. My mother, Serafina, my sister, Callie, and my brother, Kalen. They weren't dressed in black, somber attire. They looked annoyed, put upon, as if I had dragged them here to contest a parking ticket, not to answer for the life of a man hanging in the balance. As I approached with Elias at my side, my mother's face twisted into a mask of fury. She stepped forward, her voice a venomous hiss. "What in the hell do you think you're doing? You are tearing this family apart." Callie was right behind her, her arms crossed, her expression one of profound therapeutic disapproval. "Your energy is just so toxic right now, Lacey," she whispered, as if sharing a deep spiritual insight. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the courtroom doors, my back straight, my hands clasped behind me. My silence was a shield, a wall they couldn't breach with their words. It was the most powerful answer I could give. Inside, the courtroom was cold and impersonal. The air was thick with tension. We sat at one table, my family at the other, with a slick-looking lawyer in an expensive suit. The battle lines were drawn. Elias Croft was magnificent. He was calm, methodical, and ruthless. He presented our case not as a family drama, but as a financial crime. He used a projector to display the evidence on a large screen for the judge to see. One by one, the exhibits appeared. The bank statements glowing with the charges from Cabo. The color-coded Excel spreadsheet detailing the double-dipping scheme. The screenshots of Callie's Instagram posts, complete with the deserved it hashtag. My family's lawyer tried to object, to spin a narrative. "Your Honor, these were simply gifts," he argued, his voice smooth and placating. "Mr. Vance is a generous man who loves his family. His granddaughter, Petty Officer Murray, has been largely absent due to her military career. She simply doesn't understand the day-to-day burdens my clients have shouldered in caring for an elderly parent." The word absent was meant to be a dagger, to paint me as ungrateful and derelict. I felt a hot flash of anger, but Elias remained perfectly calm. "A burden, you say?" Elias responded, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned to their lawyer. "Then perhaps you can explain this particular act of care." He pressed a button. A digital audio player was connected to the court's speakers. And then Kalen's voice filled the silent courtroom, cold and dismissive. "Look, I told you I don't have time to drive you to the VA hospital for your appointment. It's on the other side of town. Just get an Uber." A dead silence fell over the room. The slick lawyer's face went pale. Kalen sank lower in his chair, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. The judge, a stern-faced man with silver hair, stared at Kalen over the top of his glasses, his expression unreadable but deeply unimpressed. The audio file was a clean, undeniable kill shot. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and faced the judge. The uniform felt heavy on my shoulders, a mantle of responsibility. I had rehearsed what I would say, but now the words came from a place deeper than memory. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and steady. "I didn't come here today to talk about money. Money can be earned and it can be lost. I came here to fight for something that, once taken, is nearly impossible to get back. A man's dignity." I glanced at my family. They refused to meet my eyes. "The opposing counsel has described me as absent." He is correct. I was absent. I was absent while serving on a destroyer in the Persian Gulf. I was absent during intelligence briefings in Sicily. I was absent while my grandfather, a man who also wore a uniform for this country, was being systematically stripped of his resources and his self-respect by the very people who should have been his staunchest defenders. My voice grew stronger, imbued with a conviction that came from my very core. My absence was not abandonment, Your Honor. My absence was service, a concept my family seems to have forgotten the meaning of. I am not here seeking revenge. I am here seeking responsibility. I am here to ensure that the man who taught me the meaning of honor and loyalty is treated with the honor and loyalty he has more than earned. I finished and sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge looked down at the file, then at me. His gaze wasn't one of pity, but of profound respect. He cleared his throat. The ruling was swift and decisive. He granted the emergency conservatorship, placing my grandfather's person and estate under my temporary legal protection. He granted the restraining order, freezing all assets. It was a total victory. As we left the courtroom, my family was in disarray, huddled with their lawyer. For the first time, they looked exactly like what they were, defeated. Winning in court felt like a distant, hollow victory. The battle I had won was one of paperwork and legal arguments. But the real war, the one against time and failing organs, was a battle I was losing. The legal victory couldn't mend a broken body. There is a prayer that people sometimes turn to, the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I had changed the things I could. Now I had to face the things I couldn't. My world shrank to the four walls of his ICU room. The anger and the fight drained out of me, replaced by a quiet, singular focus. My family, their betrayal, the court case, it all faded into background noise. The only thing that mattered was the man in the bed. I spent my days in a worn armchair pulled up close to him. I read to him from his favorite dog-eared Louis L'Amour paperbacks, the adventures of rugged cowboys and stoic lawmen in the Old West. I described the ports I had visited, the bustling markets of Naples, the stark volcanic beauty of Iceland, trying to bring the world to his bedside. I became his guardian in the truest sense. I learned the nurses' schedules. I helped them turn him. I gently washed his face with a warm cloth each morning and made sure he was always clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed. The indignity of his previous neglect was an insult I was determined to erase. I was reclaiming his honor, one small quiet act at a time. I didn't think about my mother, or Callie, or Kaylin. They didn't exist in this quiet, sacred space. My entire universe was the steady beep of the monitor, the soft hiss of the oxygen, and the feel of his hand in mine. The nurse, Maria, became my silent partner in this vigil. She would appear with a cup of hot coffee in the morning or a simple turkey sandwich on rye in the afternoon, placing it on the table without a word. Her small acts of kindness were a lifeline, a quiet acknowledgement of my solitary watch. I realized then that in our darkest moments, the brightest light often comes from the most unexpected sources. A stranger's compassion can feel more like family than blood itself. A few weeks after the court hearing, the doctor told me his body was beginning to shut down. The news didn't come as a shock, but as a heavy final truth. That afternoon, I was in the middle of a story about a tense standoff in a dusty saloon when I saw his eyelids flutter. He opened his eyes, and he looked at me. For weeks, his gaze had been distant, lost in a fog of medication and illness. But now it was clear. He knew me. His eyes, the same deep blue as the Pacific, on a clear day, were lucid. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. "It's okay, Grandpa," I whispered, leaning closer. "It's okay. I'm here." He lifted his hand, the one I was holding. It trembled with effort. Then he squeezed my hand. Once, twice, 3 times. It was our signal, a silent language we'd shared since I was a little girl sitting on his lap. It was his way of telling me a secret, of calming a childish fear, of saying good night. 3 squeezes. I love you. The dam I had built inside me, the one that had held back weeks of unshed tears, finally broke. A hot, silent sob escaped me, and tears streamed down my face. I squeezed his hand back, just as he had taught me. 1, 2, 3. "I love you too, Grandpa," I choked out. It was our goodbye, a whole lifetime of love, communicated in 3 faint pulses of a failing hand. That night, Maria gently told me that it wouldn't be long. She asked if I wanted her to stay. I shook my head. This was a watch I had to stand alone. I sat by his bed, holding his hand as the hospital grew quiet around us. I didn't cry anymore. The tears were gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I talked to him in a low, steady voice, not about cowboys or legal battles, but about the sea. I told him stories of the great warships he had served on, the destroyers and the carriers. I described the smell of salt spray on a cold morning, the deep, resonant sound of the waves against a steel hull, the endless horizon at sunset. I brought the ocean he loved into that sterile, landlocked room. Sometime after midnight, in the deepest quiet of the night, I felt a change. His breathing, which had been shallow, grew lighter still. And then, with a final, gentle sigh, it stopped. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor beside me flatlined, replaced by a single, unending tone. I sat there in the sudden, absolute silence, just holding his hand. He was gone. After the on-call doctor made the official pronouncement and Maria offered her quiet condolences, I asked for a few more minutes alone. I stayed for another hour. I gently straightened the collar of his hospital pajamas and smoothed his silver hair back from his forehead. He hadn't died alone in a house filled with neglect. He hadn't died in indignity. He had died in the loving arms of a fellow sailor with all the honor and dignity he so richly deserved. We buried my grandfather at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery on a green slope overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was a clear, bright San Diego day, the kind he loved most. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue. My family was not there. Their absence was a final, quiet admission of their character. Instead, the attendees were a small, stoic group. There was Mrs. Gable from next door, her face etched with genuine sorrow. There was Maria, the nurse from Scripps Mercy, who had come on her day off. And there were a half-dozen old men, their backs a little stooped but their shoulders still squared, wearing VFW caps and faded service ribbons on their old suit jackets. They were his friends, his brothers in arms. One of them, a man named George, came up to me before the service. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said, his voice raspy with age. "Back in '82, I was laid off from the shipyard. Couldn't make my mortgage. Silas found out, and a check just appeared in my mailbox. No note. He never said a word about it. Your grandpa, he was the guy who always showed up, even when you didn't ask." Wearing my dress blues, I delivered the eulogy. I didn't speak of betrayal or abandonment. I didn't mention the court case or the money. To do so would have been to give them power in this sacred space. Instead, I spoke of him. I spoke of the man who taught me that honor wasn't a word you said, but a thing you did. That loyalty was a verb. I spoke of his quiet strength, his unwavering moral compass, and the way his eyes would light up when he talked about the sea. After the rifle salute echoed across the hills and the bugler played the lonely, haunting notes of taps, the honor guard approached. A young sailor, his face a mask of solemn duty, presented me with the American flag, folded into a tight, perfect triangle. I accepted it, clutching it to my chest. It wasn't just a flag. It was the symbol of everything he stood for. It was the honor I had fought to protect for him. A few days later, I sat across from Elias Croft in his office. He reviewed the final paperwork for my grandfather's estate. The house, the savings, the investments. It was a substantial amount. "So what are your plans?" he asked gently. "A new start somewhere? A long vacation? You've certainly earned it." I thought about the researcher and author Brené Brown, whose work I'd read. She wrote that one of the most painful human experiences is witnessing a loved one's suffering and being powerless to stop it. But she said, we can create meaning from that pain. "I don't want it, Elias," I said. "The house, the money, none of it." He looked at me confused. "It's not my victory to enjoy," I explained. "This whole fight, it was for him. His legacy can't be a bank account. It has to be something that lives, something that helps." I took a deep breath. "I want to start a foundation using every penny of his estate. We'll call it the Vance Fund for Abandoned Veterans and Seniors. Its mission will be to provide emergency aid and pro bono legal services for people in San Diego facing exactly what he faced." This was the real victory. This was the highest form of revenge. It wasn't about punishment. It was about building something good and lasting from the ashes of their greed. It was about ensuring his name stood for help, not for victimhood. Elias stared at me for a long moment. The lawyerly professionalism fell away, and he just looked at me as a friend, his eyes filled with a profound admiration. "That," he said softly, "is the best tribute I've ever heard of." We didn't issue a press release. There were no grand announcements. The Foundation's website went live quietly one afternoon. The homepage was simple. A single black and white photo of a young Silas Vance in his Navy uniform, looking out to sea with a confident gaze. Below it, a single line of text that served as our mission statement. Some heroes get left behind, not anymore. A few days later, sitting in the quiet of my grandfather's old office, an email notification pinged on my laptop. The subject line read, "Help for my father." It was from a woman whose elderly father, a Vietnam vet, was being financially exploited by her brother. She wrote that she felt helpless and alone and had stumbled upon our site during a desperate late-night search. I read her story, and my heart ached with a familiar pain. But this time, the pain wasn't accompanied by helplessness. It was accompanied by purpose. I couldn't save my own grandfather from his fate. But as I typed out my reply, scheduling a call, I realized that because of him, I might just be able to help save someone else's. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. Once news of the Vance Fund became public, and it became clear that the inheritance they'd been counting on had vanished into a charitable trust, the inevitable happened. The echoes from my past began to clamor for attention. It started with anger. A barrage of furious, all-caps text messages from Kaylin, filled with threats and accusations. I read them, deleted them, and felt nothing. Then came the second wave, pathetic, pleading voicemails from my mother, her voice cracking as she talked about her dire financial straits, as if I were somehow responsible for the consequences of her own actions. The final, most insidious wave was manipulation, cloaked in the language of therapy and blame. My sister, Kali, sent tearful video messages, her face artfully tear-streaked, talking about how she'd done the work and learned her lesson, and how she needed my forgiveness to complete her healing journey. The worst, however, was a long, rambling email from my mother, Serafina. It was a masterclass in narcissistic revisionist history. She never once apologized. Instead, she painted herself as the victim. She wrote about how my coldness and selfishness had robbed her of the chance to say a final goodbye to her own father. She accused me of poisoning him against them, of isolating him in his final days. It was a breathtaking attempt to reframe her abandonment as my crime. I read every word of every message. I watched every second of every video. I did it not with anger or with pain, but with the cold, detached curiosity of a bomb disposal expert examining an unexploded device. I needed to understand its mechanics, to see every wire, every trigger, before I disarmed it for good. I saw the patterns, the predictable cycles of rage, pity, and manipulation. And in their desperate, self-serving words, I felt only a profound, hollow emptiness. The part of me that could have been hurt by them had already died. There's a saying, you don't have to attend every argument you're invited to. For years, I had RSVP'd yes to every toxic invitation my family had sent, no more. I didn't reply to a single message. A reply, any reply, would be an engagement. It would signal that the door was still open, even a crack. Instead, I performed a quiet, final ritual of severance. I sat down with my phone, my laptop open beside me. This wasn't an act of impulsive anger. It was a deliberate, strategic decision to build a firewall around the peace I had fought so hard to win. I started with my phone's contacts. I found my mother's name, tapped on it, scrolled down, and pressed block this caller. A confirmation popped up. I pressed block contact. I repeated the process for Callie and then for Kaylin. Next, I opened my email. I created a new filter. I entered their email addresses. For the action, I selected delete it and also apply filter to matching conversations. With a final click, decades of painful, demanding, and manipulative emails vanished from my inbox and were barred from ever entering it again. Finally, I went to social media. One by one, I blocked their profiles on every platform. It was a digital amputation, a clean, decisive cut. With each click, I felt a weight lifting. I was reclaiming my space, my silence, my sanity. I finally understood that family is not a life sentence. You get to choose who has access to you. That evening, I was working late at the foundation, which I'd headquartered in my grandfather's old house. I sat in his office, the window open to the cool night air, the distant sound of the ocean a steady, calming presence. I looked out at the dark water, and I had a final conversation, not with them, but with myself. I realized I would not forgive them. Forgiveness felt like a betrayal of my grandfather. It would mean saying that what they did was, on some level, acceptable, that it could be absorbed, processed, and moved past. It couldn't. It was a permanent stain. To forgive it would be to diminish the gravity of their cruelty. Instead, I chose to forgive myself. I forgave myself for not seeing the truth sooner. I forgave myself for the years of youthful innocence when I believed their version of reality. I forgave myself for the guilt I had carried, the feeling of never being good enough that they had so expertly cultivated in me, and I accepted the truth. Some relationships are not meant to be salvaged. They are fatally wounded, toxic to the core. They don't need healing, they need a burial. And letting them go, truly and completely letting them go, was the healthiest and most honest act of self-love I could possibly perform. The war was over, the echoes had faded, and for the first time there was only a peaceful, promising silence. Several years have passed since the funeral at Fort Rosecrans. After finishing my final tour of duty, I took my honorable discharge from the Navy. The sea will always be a part of me, but I knew my new mission was here, on solid ground. I now run the Vance Fund full-time, out of my grandfather's house. The house is no longer a war room or a place of sorrow. It's a space of quiet purpose and hope. The lingering ghosts of neglect have been banished, replaced by the smell of fresh paint and brewing coffee. The backyard, once a sad, overgrown patch of weeds, is now my sanctuary. I learned to love gardening, finding a meditative peace in turning the soil. It's now filled with the fragrant, deep red roses my grandfather loved, and sprawling vines of San Marzano tomatoes, their bright red fruit heavy in the California sun. My life is quiet now, built around small, meaningful rituals. I start each morning with a cup of coffee on the back porch, watching the hummingbirds dart and hover among the flowers, their iridescent throats flashing in the morning light. I listen to the sounds of the neighborhood waking up. I feel the cool breeze blow in from the ocean. This peace wasn't a gift. It wasn't an inheritance. It was a victory I had fought for, a piece of ground I had claimed and fortified. It was earned. A few months ago, I did something just for him. I had a small brass plaque made and installed it on a bench in Balboa Park. It was his favorite bench, one that looked out over the lily pond and the botanical building. It was where we used to sit and share a hot dog on sunny afternoons. The plaque is simple, understated. It reads, "In memory of Silas Vance, for those who show up." Last week, I was walking through the park and saw an elderly man sitting on the bench. He wore a faded USS Midway cap and was just staring quietly at the fountain, a look of peaceful contemplation on his face. He had no idea of the story behind the plaque he was leaning against. He just saw a place to rest. And in that moment, I knew my grandfather's legacy was alive. It wasn't a grand monument. It was a quiet place of rest. For another old soldier, a silent acknowledgement for all the others who understood the simple, profound importance of just being there. I no longer seek inspiration from books or quotes. I don't need to. I've learned that the most powerful source of strength comes from a life lived with purpose, from the quiet conviction of your own choices. I have become my own source of inspiration. This morning, a small package arrived in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small wax paper wrapped bundle. The letter was from the daughter of the Vietnam veteran I had first helped, the woman whose email had launched the foundation. She wrote that because of the fund's legal help, her father had been able, to get a restraining order against her brother and was now safe. He was able to stay in his own home instead of being forced into a nursing facility. At the bottom of the letter, she wrote, "He wanted you to have these. It's his own recipe." I unwrapped the bundle. Inside were a half-dozen oatmeal raisin cookies, still soft. The smell was warm, sweet, and filled with a simple, honest goodness. It was the smell of gratitude. I'm sitting in his office now, the letter on the desk beside me. The late afternoon sun streams through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I no longer feel the cold anger that once fueled me, nor the hollow ache of grief. All that's left is a deep, quiet sense of gratitude. I didn't just win a legal battle, I protected the legacy of a good man. I honored his life by giving his values a future. They always say that blood is thicker than water. I've learned that's not true. It's a convenient lie, an excuse for obligation without action. Loyalty is thicker than water. Honor is thicker than water. Showing up, that is thicker than water. My grandfather taught me that, not with words, but with his life. And that is the lesson I will carry with me for the rest of mine. I lean back in his old chair, close my eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, I just smile. I am at peace. My grandfather taught me that the most important people are the ones who show up. My story had its own battlefield, but I know I'm not alone in fighting these quiet wars. And it makes me think about all of you listening right now. So I want to ask you, who was the person who showed up for you? Who was your rock when the world felt unsteady? I would be truly honored to read about them in the comments below. And if stories about resilience, honor, and finding strength in the hardest of times resonate with you, I hope you'll follow Chosen Revenge so we can continue to share them together.